go.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this, what is a snowy day here on the East Coast. Our guest speaker is luckily coming to us from Mesa, Arizona, where he can brag about the temperature and the fine weather over there. Before we, thank you again, this is part of a series from Maryland Online, a bunch of webinars that were happening this spring. I encourage you to keep looking in your email box for invites to other ones and join in because they've all been fabulous. So just a couple of pieces of housekeeping before we get started. If you could remain mute and your cameras off during the presentation, that will be helpful. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will be asking them of Stephen at the end of the session. And so without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Stephen Crawford. He is the District Director of the Maricopa Center for Learning and Innovation at the Maricopa Community Colleges in Arizona, and has been involved in distance learning for over 20 years at multiple institutions as a technologist, an instructional designer, and an adjunct faculty. And he has authored several articles and chapters on flipped teaching and blended learning. In addition, he is a Quality Matters facilitator and master reviewer. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Stephen Crawford.
And thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and let me get a couple of things, my screen set up so I can see everything I need to see. Okay, and so again, Stephen Crawford, here is my email and Twitter handle. So if you want to reach me after the session is over or ask questions that you don't have time to, or et cetera, during this, please feel free to reach out to me. I love chatting on this topic with folks. And so let's get started by, being a good instructional designer. Let's what are our goals that we're going to try to achieve today in this session? So we're going to talk about some of the key issues related to flipped, and I included blended learning as well, because there is some overlap. And I'm going to also highlight where those overlaps occur and where they do not occur. But really, we're going to really focus on describing how to integrate synchronous and asynchronous components into a flipped course. And I've purposely chosen a change in language when talking about flipped learning in particular and blended learning because of the pandemic and some of the lessons we've learned in these past 11 months. For me, the last time I was physically in my office was 11 months ago today. So let's start with some key terms. The first one is flipped classroom. And this goes back quite a bit. The furthest back I've seen this mentioned in the literature was 1999. A business faculty member by the last name of Lage, L-A-G-E, wrote about his inverted classroom. What he did was he recorded his classroom lectures on VHS tape and put those VHS tapes in the business office lab or tutoring center or whatever they had for this facility. And his students were instructed to go watch the tapes on their own time. And then when they came into the classroom, the expectation was they were going to, quote, do their homework in the classroom with him. And the idea behind that was this would allow him to provide them the guidance they needed to accomplish the tasks he was giving them for homework and have expert help available right then and there as they were doing their homework. And if they were watching the lectures on tape, they would have the benefit of him providing content during that. And that is essentially the crux of what a flipped classroom is. The idea is you're just flipping or inverting what you do in the classroom to home and what you do at home into the classroom. And a lot of faculty who've adopted this model have really taken to it. And a lot of their students will tell you that that transition at first is weird because we've been trained generation after generation that good teaching is going into a classroom and being told what to know for an hour 3 times a week. And we know from research that's not the best way to learn. The lecture has a place in education for providing important content, but why are we using our our seat time, our face-to-face time with those students to provide content, to our students, when we could actually shift that to their homework and then provide them the opportunity to get guided help from the faculty member directly in the classroom as they're working through activities and doing active learning at that point. And so that's kind of what we mean by the flipped classroom is essentially shifting that content completely to outside the classroom and doing the homework inside the classroom. Now, this is very different from blended or hybrid learning. And it gets confused with blended learning quite a bit. And the reason for that is blended learning is all about reducing seat time. That is the basis of blended learning. The goal is, instead of meeting in a classroom twice a week for an hour and a half, you meet once a week for an hour and a half. Instead of, so therefore you reduce the seat time from 3 hours to an hour and a half. Or if you meet 3 times a week for 1 hour, maybe dropping one of those sessions. So now you're meeting for a total of 2 hours for 2 sessions of 1 hour each. So you're reducing that seat time. And by reducing that seat time, you're replacing it with some other activity. And that could be more readings, that could be videos, that could be, more homework. But what you're seeing in a lot of places is that flipped learning, people are adopting that into blended as well. So that's why it often gets confused. You can be blended and not flipped, and you can be flipped and not blended. The two are completely separate. But there are a lot of us who will move our content delivery totally online. And then what we'll also do is we'll move the homework into the classroom. And then if we reduce seat time, now it's blended. And so that's the big difference there. So I'm going to hit the Wayback Machine and go back in time a little bit. So I began my career in distance learning doing things like this, where the classroom was virtual. And you can see in one of those pictures, the round of tables in a classroom that we had built. And we were super proud of ourselves with this classroom because we had these plasma screen monitors all over the room. The microphones on the table were always on. There was no push to talk. The room caught audio the entire time, including between class sessions. Or between breaks in a class. And the computer could actually be on a cable anywhere in that. So you could pass the computer around. Or if you're a remote student, you would show up in one of those monitors as if you were in the classroom. And, we had other rooms set up. We were doing this over satellite. We were doing this. And so this picture's from around 2007, and that classroom's from 2007. So we were beginning to play with this thing called a video bridge and the Polycom. And Polycom as a company had created the first consumer internet camera systems for doing video conferencing, much like we're doing today, except we're doing it with far less hardware, far less expense, and it's just a lot easier and higher quality off of our computer than we could even imagine in 2007. So we've gone full circle thanks to this pandemic. We've started teaching like we taught literally 13, 14 years ago, longer in many cases. And so we're kind of back to that virtual classroom with our remote learning. And that's where I think talking about a change in language is very, very important now. Because when I go back and I think about the flipped classroom, I no longer think about seat time. I no longer think, and same thing with blended learning. I no longer think about reducing seat time. I'm now thinking about it from the point of view of synchronous time versus asynchronous time. How do I want to use my valuable time when I am directly interacting with the student? Do I want to use that time to focus on speaking to the students and lecturing them, or do I want to use that time in a different manner? So let's think about that here for a moment. And in the chat, I'd like you to drop some ideas of what are some examples of asynchronous learning? What are things that you would do with your student asynchronously when you don't have them in front of you, but you want them to do some things on their own? So what are some options on the table that you can think about from a classroom standpoint and a teaching and learning standpoint? have them do an assignment. Yes, the traditional homework assignments, going through different things like that, watching course videos, doing the readings, the discussion board, using that to extend a classroom conversation, written assignments, projects, group work. Again, we're seeing assessments. Yes. I always found it interesting when people would use their limited classroom time or, to do an assessment. It's like you only have them for so long. Crossword, puzzle games, worksheets, those are great ideas. And those are things that if we, as we think about activities, those active learning things that we can do with our students without us being there, these are great activities to have them work on. So with that in mind, what are activities that we want our students to do with us when they have us synchronously? And we'll have you guys put some more ideas into the chat on this one. Discussions are a great one. Having those class discussions, group work is another great opportunity, especially with the technology we have today, like with Zoom and WebEx. All these tools are now allowing you to do breakout rooms. So you can actually, as the instructor, hop from room to room and answer questions. Like we see here from Karen saying, ask questions to get clarity on difficult concepts. Discussions, we've talked about that. So important. Debates, case studies, clicker questions, coaching, making presentations, and those conversations are so important. I would throw in another one is mini lectures. And that's an opportunity to where if a question comes up, you go, okay, there seems to be a general confusion on this topic. Let me hit pause and let me represent just this one segment for 5 minutes. And that's it. Or maybe even 7 to 10, depending on what it is. But you don't want to take too much time. But that's a great place where you can answer questions and clarify confusion and just help students work through things. And again, we see in some studies where institutions have adopted flipped learning and even blended learning, but flipped learning especially, where the students kind of push back at first. They're kind of like, ooh, I'm not sure about this. This is not what you did last year because my friends were in your class last year. Oh, demonstrations, hands-on activities and experiments. That's another good one as well. And that's where when we think about the students, it takes them a little time to get used to it, but that's okay. If we give them a good infrastructure and a good structure, we'll see that this will turn out to be really good. So again, let's think about this from an administrative standpoint. And as a district director, I tend to think more administratively than I used to when I was an instructional designer. But when I worked with faculty, we'd have this nice policy from our, as mentioned, I was with Arizona State University, and our Arizona Board of Regents had it very nicely laid out. Your traditional face-to-face 3 credit hour class was 3 hours in the classroom, which meant for every hour in the classroom, you did 2 hours of homework. So 3 hours in the classroom, 6 hours at homework, that equals 9 hours. So there was a 9-hour expectation. And so when you think about that from a blended learning standpoint, we're focused solely on seat time. And so it's like, okay, we're going to do a 33% reduction because we love having these percentages where it's like to be official with the processes and procedures. And so if you had a 3 credit hour course, the expectation was, well, you're still going to have 6 hours of homework because it's a 3 credit hour course because 3 times 2 equals 6. But if you slide 1 hour away from classroom time, that meant you had 1 hour of online time, whatever the heck that meant, for a total of 9 hours. So we get that aspect of it. That's easy enough. But when you think about it from a pandemic standpoint and you say, you know what, let's forget the classroom. Let's forget all about being in a classroom because we don't know when we're going to be in there next. Or better yet, we're doing this all remotely and we don't know how much longer we're going to be doing it remotely. Let's think about it from a simple standpoint of synchronous versus asynchronous. And whether we continue this model of remote learning, whether, however we do this in the future, this is a really great way to look at it because that traditional policy of 3 hours of synchronous time with the 6 hours of asynchronous time still equals 9. So we're meeting all of our regulatory guidelines. But from that blended standpoint, you're literally just moving 1 hour from one column to the other because there's no other math involved. And so again, you're still at 9 hours and you're going, we're just going to have 2 hours of synchronous time. By thinking about things from a synchronous, asynchronous standpoint versus seat time versus online versus maybe live online, as some people are calling it, or remote teaching or virtual classroom, or whatever we're going to call those things, we add layers. We just add so many layers that makes the planning and the thinking a little difficult. If we think about it from the point of view of, I'm doing this synchronously with you, I don't know if I'm doing it synchronously with you in a physical classroom or a virtual classroom, but probably from an instructional standpoint, 80% of what we're going to do, it may not matter. Now, if you're teaching a lab class, if you are teaching something in the career and technical education area like welding or auto mechanics or avionics or even going to the arts with pottery, okay, that may be a little different, because you need to physically be in a space to do something. So yeah, saying that the synchronous time doesn't matter as much. I understand that. I'm going to put a caveat on that right there. But when we think about a lot of our traditional topics, our traditional educational topics, you think about our math and our Englishes and our psychology, and just kind of go from there. We're looking at things a little differently because whether it's online synchronously or face-to-face synchronously doesn't matter as much, as long as we've planned appropriately. So let's talk about how this kind of maps out a little bit. And this is a chart that I had put together a number of years ago to kind of explain the role of technology. And it used to say the role of the reduction of seat time, but now I'm thinking about it of the reduction of synchronous time. And so obviously, we've seen charts like this talking about where online learning fits, but you can see we're blended in the flipped classroom land as well now. Because if you're not using the flipped class, if you're using technology in your classroom, your technology, you're not reducing your synchronous time, you're just enhancing the learning with technology. That's all you're really doing. But if you're using the flipped classroom to create an environment that's active both in the classroom and online, that is definitely a flipped. That's the difference between flipped and technology enhanced learning, is that active learning piece. Because many of us, I go back to my old days, I use technology in my face-to-face course. I had Blackboard. I put my PowerPoint slides up there. I have grades. Students submit things to there. Does that mean I'm online or a flipped class? No, it doesn't. But when I start using active learning to enhance things, that's where, and technology has a role in that. That's where that helps more. Okay, so now let's bring this down to the course level. Let's get down into the instructional design and what faculty really want to know. What does this mean to me? And more importantly, what does this mean to my class? So when we think about synchronous time, I like to think about my class in 3 parts. There's that pre-class part where my students need to do something asynchronously to be prepared. And then there's my classroom part, that's synchronous time. And that synchronous time is either going to be in person, video conferencing, whatever the case may be. And then there may be a post-class period, that's going to be asynchronously, something that the students are going to need to do to wrap up after the class is over. And so when you think about the class and those 3 distinct parts, it changes how you approach your course design. And so a lot of us, we will say, students, please read chapter 4 by the next class. And if you're like me, you're probably going, yes, how many of us actually read chapter 4 by the next class? I will tell you, as an undergrad, that was not me. I did not read that. As a grad student, I will tell you that was me. I read everything ahead of time. But as an undergrad, I barely read the textbook after the class. So I'll be honest, And I think that's one of the things we have to keep in mind during this design. And so one of the questions that usually comes up here is what happens when the student doesn't do their pre-class stuff? And I've seen, and this is where I've seen flipped classes fail. And that is the students did not watch the videos ahead of time. They were not prepared to enter the classroom. And so what happens is the instructor, the faculty member looks across the class, realizes nobody or realizes enough people didn't do the work, so they can't do the activities that they had planned. So what they end up doing is they end up rushing a lecture and squeezing it into the class. And then they squeeze the activities in there. They have time to do neither well. And the class feels like it's a class and a half because you've done so much work. And then what happens is the students go, well, if you're going to tell me everything I was supposed to learn before I came in the class, I'm just going to stop doing the pre-class work. So we end up feeding a feedback where it just keeps coming back on itself, and the students start doing less and less as the semester goes on. And now we're doing more, we're squeezing it all in every class session, and it's a complete failure for everybody. Faculty just feel burned out and frustrated. Our students may be successful, but no one's really purely happy, and that's always frustrating. So let's look at how those three parts interact. And this is how I like to look at it. You've got two spheres, asynchronous and synchronous. And you can see the arrows flowing from one sphere to another. And what this means is that those three distinct parts, you could start off and you've got a module you're teaching in your class, and you don't teach that in one class session. You don't even do it in 5 class sessions, maybe. But what you do is you have pieces that the students need to do pre-class. So maybe there are some things they do, and then they bring that with them, that either knowledge or something physical, into the classroom or to the synchronous time. And you do that, you do something in the synchronous time that has an immediate impact on what the students do next. And that could be a reflection, or it could be a continuation on their own that they either then add more readings to and more knowledge to, and then they bring that back into the synchronous time, where again, they do group work, maybe continue to work on their project, and then they just go back and forth until they have achieved the endpoint that is designed. And so that's one of the ways to think about the flow. So when you're thinking about the flow like this, how do you work this through? How do you script this out? And so I've got a chart here on what I think about as a purposeful integration. And I like to, I love using that phrase on purpose, because it's really about how, it's not about using the two sections. It's about truly integrating them. One of the things I had back here, I want to highlight, is on the thing about a blended or hybrid learning. And the reason why I have those two images on the screen is there are 2 types of blended learning courses. One is where you just bolt online materials onto what you're already doing, and you go, this is great. But the problem is you can undo that bolt, and now you're back to how you were doing things before. What we really want to do here is like the picture of the paint. We want to mix different colors of paint together to create a new color. Because once you do that, you can't unmix the paint. So that's what we're trying to do here. Is we're trying to take different colors of paint here and create something new that you just don't willy-nilly undo. So from the point of view of this learning objective that I have here developed from a unit, we want this is from an instructional design course, and the goal is for students to create a training unit. We're teaching students to use an ISD process to do this. And so what we go, okay, what kind of activities do I need our students to do or want them to do? Well, I know I want them to view some video lectures because I put these together. I've got these video lectures I've built. Maybe I've curated a couple from some experts in the field. I want students to review sample plans. I want them to be familiar with what the goal is going to look like so they can see that. I have a completed knowledge quiz in here, and you'll see where that's really important, how that comes into play here shortly. But most importantly, is I want them to work in groups, because this is not an individual thing. This is a group work. Now, I rarely use the word group work. Probably the better word to use is teamwork. And for those who aren't familiar with the difference between teamwork and group work is when you put about 4 students together and tell them go do something. Teamwork is where you give 4 students different tasks and different roles to fulfill, and you tell them to work as a team. It's kind of like using the sports metaphor. You're the quarterback, you're the wide receiver, you're the running back, and you're the lineman. So everybody knows what their job is, and so therefore they can work as a team. When you put them in 4 people in a group and say good luck with that, they may or may not negotiate roles, but in their teams they're going to develop a training module. And I looked at that, and and as a modality, I was like, where does this come into play? Where do they need me? Well, they don't need me to watch video lectures. They don't need me to read over sample plans. They don't need me either to really do the quiz. They really need me to help guide them through the process. And so that's where I'm going to put my emphasis of synchronous time. And that's where I'm going to make sure I am most available to work with them. And then I have my assignments. My goals are, I want the students to be able to demonstrate, the comprehension. So they have to show knowledge of the process. That goes back to the quiz. And then they also have to be able to develop that unit, which goes back to that assignment you're seeing. And so therefore you're seeing the key assessment in this module is obviously developing that unit of training. And so with that in mind, how do I communicate that to our students? Well, here's the course planning chart I might give our students in the syllabus. And they can see they're going to have 2 classes in this setup, and they're going to have some pre-class activities in this topic. They see they have to view the online lectures. They have to review this process, and they have to do this quiz. And then after they do that, when they get into the synchronous activity, they're going to have to be able to discuss that ISD process, because we're going to have a conversation so that I can clear up any misconceptions they have of what that is in that first class. And then we're going to form our groups and explore training unit topics. And then they're going to have some assignments due. And you can see there's an online quiz, which is obviously before synchronous time. But after the synchronous time is over, or as it ends, they're going to have to submit to me what topic area they're going to do for their training unit. So that assignment, I could make it due after the synchronous time so they can have some more time to work on it. But the key thing is it needs to be shortly after that synchronous time is over, so they can then use the rest of the pre-class time for the next class to get ready, or the pre-synchronous time. And that's where they're going to look at more online presentations that have been developed, because now they're, from an instructional standpoint, that first time they're getting the big 50,000 foot view. Now they're getting down into the nitty gritty of this is the details of the process. And they're going to begin to assemble resources to develop their plan. Notice they're not doing it out of the class. They're just bringing the resources together. And then, there may be certain topics like doing a needs assessment they're going to have to do. And then that's where they're going to come in, and they're going to not just develop their plan, but they're also going to present it to everybody in the class. And then after that's over, they're going to submit that assessment plan at some point after the class is over. So this is a great way to kind of look at that flow as you think about how things are going on this graph, on this Venn diagram type graph, showing the flow from going asynchronous to synchronous and back, pre-class to class to post-class. And so that's a very important piece. And one of the things I think that can help an instructor the most as you're moving into the flipped classroom is formative and summative assessments. And we talk about this a lot in instructional design. And a lot of times we get hung up on the summative assessments, and we kind of forget about the formatives. The formative assessment can be super, super critical here. One of the concepts you'll hear often when it comes to talking about flipped classrooms and formative assessments is known as the ticket in. So there's a lot of faculty who, during the pre-pandemic days, when they were in the classroom, they would say that in order to physically enter the classroom, you had to bring something with you. So you had to, if you were in an environmental science class, for an example, and you were supposed to do an observation of the different types of plants in your neighborhood, if you didn't bring that into the classroom, you didn't have an artifact that was critical for the classroom discussion. Therefore, you weren't able to participate in the classroom discussion. And so I've seen faculty send those students back out and say, you can't come in the classroom. You have to go out and you have to do this and then come back in. And if you cut, it's better to come in late with your materials than to come in without them. Another version of the ticket in is a quiz or a survey. So an example of this one would be that knowledge quiz that you saw listed here, the online quiz. So for an example, if I had an online quiz where the students had to answer questions and I saw where 25% or 20% of the class missed the same question, and I looked at those results 5 minutes before class started, then I could then take that opportunity to go in and say, okay, hey guys, I saw on the quiz where a number of you had some confusion on this topic. Let me take a few moments to address some of the common misconceptions and problems that students have, and then see if you have any more questions after that. So it provides you immediate feedback on what the students are having difficulty with and may need a little extra instruction on. And this is where we've seen students make that shift. So I talked about in the beginning, students kind of get frustrated with flipped classrooms in the beginning because what they'll say is, oh, this is not what they did last year. My friends had it easier because you told them all the answers in the lecture, and here you're making me learn it on my own. And so it's not uncommon to see that the course evaluations drop that first semester. And then what's surprising is it's also not uncommon to see the grades go up that first semester. And then what we've seen is over time, usually by the third consecutive semester, the course evaluations have not just gotten back to where they were pre-flipping, they're now higher. The students are performing higher and they're more satisfied with the class because they don't remember that it used to be different. They've gotten used to the model, especially if it's not the only class in their program. If other classes are doing it, it makes it a lot easier. And what happens is the students then look at the instructor and the faculty member a lot differently. Instead of being a content provider, to use the old saying, sage on a stage, they really see that person as an expert because that person is truly walking the classroom, going from group to group and going, ooh, time out. I've got the same question 3 times in a row, and then gives a 5-minute presentation that appears to be off the top of their head. And they're like, wow, this person knows their stuff. I had faculty as an undergrad way back when who I think were using the same acetate slides that they had created 20 years before me and was just flipping through their binder of slides, class after class after class, year after year after year, and not changing anything they were doing. So when that person is standing in the middle of the room and suddenly presenting, it makes them look more like an expert and it really allows them to shine. And the students do connect to that and they do recognize that. So as we're actually getting closer towards the end here, I feel like I may have not explained some things well. I've also, not much, I know there are only a few of you here, so I'm used to a little bit more in the chat, but I have a couple of resources available. And these bit.ly links will take you to some Word docs that I have that will help you plan some of these things out. And you can see the pre-class, class, and post-class activity if these are templates you want to use to help you create artifacts to help build your course and design it. And then, of course, when you're getting towards doing that integration, here is that form as well. So I would use this often to communicate to the students, but this is the one I would actually use to prepare my class ahead of time as I'm thinking it through. So with that in mind, what could I have made more clear? What questions do you have? And how can we go from here?
Thank you, Steve. I can tell you that no one has put any questions in the chat box, but we are a rather small group. So if you're willing, we could entertain questions live. Oh, we do have a couple of questions coming in.
Good, good. Yes, we can definitely take questions live. More description of how to get students to do pre-class. Patricia, that's a good question. And, there's some really interesting studies out there on videos. I've been doing a lot of work on what makes a good quality video. And so this is a question. One of the research studies I've seen shows that students who are required to watch a video that demonstrates how to do the lab for a lab course prior to going to the lab, the view rate is super high in the beginning of the semester. But by the time you get about 2/3 through the semester, it starts to drop off. And I think that is more of a product of the fact that we are on a 15, 16-week semester. I personally have a strong affinity to the 7.5, 8-week semester more than, or doing 2 classes at a time as opposed to 4. So I think that is a very important question. I think part of it, most of what faculty will tell you is who've done this, and I happen to agree with this statement, is it's almost a sink or swim situation where we have to be careful with ourselves to not, if our students aren't doing the readings, if they're not doing watching the videos, we can't bail them out. Now, if they're not doing it for a socioeconomic reason, let's have a different conversation. Because I also recognize a lot of the faculty who are saying that are probably coming from a place where their students are maybe a little bit more privileged than others. I know here in the community colleges, we have to be a little bit more mindful of that. Our students, and it is now true for a lot of four-year institutions as well, our students work full-time and they have families. And so it's really hard to think about that. So the question might become, do you offer some classes and advertise them as flipped and others as something else? And then the question then becomes, what's the difference if the students aren't performing as well historically? We've seen flipped classroom is better academically because the students are learning more and they're performing better. So it really is a very hard thing to adjust. I will say that there's one statement in it that a co-author of mine put into one of the chapters we did, for a book on the flipped classroom. And that is that your A student is the one who comes to class prepared. That is often coming to class prepared is critical. And that's where I'd also take a look at Dr. Sandra McGuire's work and her book, Teaching Students How to Learn and Teach Yourself How to Learn. One is aimed at faculty, one is aimed at students, and getting into the metacognition. And I think as we get more into that area of metacognition, we then are in a better place to assist our students in being successful and recognizing how to do some of these things and doing that. Francis asked the question about adjusting as you go. And I think that's always a criticism of online learning, is that people feel like you build the class and you're kind of stuck in that structure. I think that with flipped classroom, yes, you're building a structure, but there should always be room to adjust. Whether that's due to a snow emergency, which again, being here in central Arizona, we don't have many of those. But things do happen, and you do have days that you don't have class. How do you handle that? You have times where the students just aren't getting it and you need to change the schedule. And that's one of the things I think that is very much, I think, as we look at I think that's where flipped is better than some of the fully online models, because of the fact that you can adjust more easily even though you have online materials, you may have to move around. So I would always say, you always come in with a plan and you come in with your milestones for where you want to get your students to certain points, but you work with the students you have. Another question on politically speaking, do you get pushback on less seat time? And the answer is it depends. Let's see here. How much trouble do I want to get into? There are some institutions who do blended learning because they're not ready for online learning. And in fact, it's often seen as a way to dip your toe into the online world without actually entering it. And they're doing that either because the institution isn't ready for online learning or the accrediting body of the program is not ready. And maybe the accrediting body doesn't allow for that. So those are some political areas that, those are policies and procedures you just can't touch. There's one institution I'm aware of who considers themselves number one in innovation, who has talked about, they charge an extra fee for blended learning is what I'll say. They actually charge you a classroom fee, and they have what I call classroom cops. And if you don't use your classroom enough, they will actually bill your students the blended learning fee onto their courses, which can be very problematic if they're about to graduate and suddenly they're asked to pay an extra $50 right before graduation because the faculty member didn't meet in the classroom the number of times they were supposed to meet. And I have a problem with that, politically speaking. When classroom space is at a prime, should we need to encourage blended learning, and we should not make students pay extra for that. And they always use it under the guise of, oh, but we're using more technology for blended learning. Well, guess what? If you're doing flipped learning, you're probably using the same technologies. You're just not paying for it. So I had a lot of problems with that institution and told them so, that I thought their policy was against innovation despite their branding. So yeah, that's something to be mindful of. If your institution has a policy where your students do not pay a technology fee for taking a face-to-face course, then flipped learning is your friend, because if you can get all the technology and not pay the fee, go get it. But if they're going to make you pay the fee to do blended learning, then do not reduce seat time, even though it's better for your students. Students love blended learning because of the fact that if you do this, if you block classes correctly, they could actually be in a position where they take all of their classes on Monday mornings and Wednesday mornings. They can take a 16-week semester, 4 hours on Monday, 4 on Wednesday. They now have all of Monday afternoon and all of Wednesday afternoon to do what needs to be done: work, homework, family, etc., as well as Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Whereas if you're doing a situation where you have them on Friday mornings as well, you're taking away time that that makes their study schedule hard, because I didn't mention the other word in there called sleep. And so we know how sleep deprived some of our students are because of the schedules they're working just to keep the power on in their houses and to keep food on the table. And that's a critical issue when they're food insecure, housing insecure, transportation insecure. So that's where blended learning and you blocking your courses can work really well, because you can, especially if your students are relying on public transportation, they don't have to pay as much to take the bus to the campus to take their classes if they're blocked well at the same time. Voluntary study sections mixed in. The old idea of recitations, which exists in some programs, but are used very weirdly in some programs, and I don't think as intended. They're always good. As an adjunct for Scottsdale Community College, we still run our tutoring lab. We run a virtual tutoring lab now, and all the faculty in the department takes different shifts. So my shift is on Monday evenings from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. And I've done this for 4 weeks now, and I've had one student show up. And that may just be because of when I'm there and my time, but they assign me that time because students have been there in the past. And so other faculty, may or may not be seeing students at all. And we're open to anybody in our program, not just for my class. I'm there to help everybody who's taking a CIS course. And same thing with the other faculty as well. And so I think having those resources available, I know students would drop into the physical room between and after classes. And that's one of the things about being in person that is fantastic, is that if the student had that hour break between classes, you could walk them down to the computer lab and either work with them or hand them off to somebody to work with them. And with the virtual labs, I can screen share, I can take over their screen, I can do whatever needs to be, or I can just watch and guide them through a conversation and help them think through it. And those are things that I think are very valuable. And so I hope a lot of departments are providing resources like that. Do you recommend making the pre-class work a graded component or not? So as an instructional designer, the purist in me says formative assessments are never graded because they're not summative. Summative assessments should always impact a grade, and formative should never impact a grade. As a realist, I will also say I argue with my fellow instructional designers, and I say it needs to have a couple of points attached to it. I remember the old days where we used to have attendance points. Just showing up got you 25% of your grade or 20% of your grade or 10%. I hated that. Just showing up got you points for your grade. If you're one of those people who still do that, I'm not insulting you, but that's an opportunity to move those points to that. Say, this is what attendance means. It means doing these pre-class activities successfully. So if you are going to do that, because it's formative, I also allow students multiple attempts. Sometimes it's only 2 attempts. Sometimes it's like, take it till you get it. And I get that some students will take it over and over and over again until they get full points. Those students are probably the ones who's going to get an A in the class anyway. And then I look at, the students who take it once and they get 2 out of 10 and they're done. I'm like, you left 8 points on the table, go pick them up. And they don't do it. It drives me nuts. So the purest answer is no. Formative assessments should never have a graded component. But I think as a realist, having points attached to it and allowing multiple attempts, at least 2 attempts, is reasonable. And so that's where you're going to hear different answers from different instructional designers, and that's usually where they're coming from. And then the recommendation of how long recorded videos should be. Do we have an hour? Because I have read a lot of research on this, and I will tell you that when I started, the number of videos where people had just recorded themselves going, well, this is normally a 3-hour course where I lecture for 3 hours. I'm just going to record a 3-hour lecture and put it online. Yeah, that's painful. Not just for the students, but for the faculty member as well, because they were doing voiceover PowerPoints and they were doing nursing. And when things changed, they had to change a slide. They had to have all of the resources saved where they could get to it and hope it would they had it all and then hope it republished correctly. And that often worked. Occasionally it didn't. And those were very painful days. Or if even worse, they had to revoice over one slide. So there's a different audio difference. So I don't recommend a time specifically. I will tell you the research is showing a variety of times. They're showing 6 minutes or less. They're showing 7 to 10 minutes. They're saying never go over 15, never go over 20. I'm going to say it depends on what the heck you're doing, because if you're doing an interview with an expert in the field, that could be quite interesting to watch for 20 or 30 minutes or even an hour. If you're doing a content presentation, my recommendation is to focus on what are you saying and chunk it up by content. So for an example, I had a faculty member once who said, I got a 40-minute presentation. I can't get it any shorter. I talked to her about chunking it. She goes, I can't chunk it any further. The 3 steps are what they are. And then she said that. She goes, I could do each step as a separate presentation, couldn't I? And next thing you know, she had 10 to 12-minute videos after that ready to go, because each step was self-contained. It gave this chance for a student to step back, absorb it. If you wanted to provide a little quiz in between, you could. And then when they were ready to go to the next one, they went to the next one. And if they went through all three and they were somehow confused on step two, it was so easy to just watch step two after that. So that's one of the things to kind of keep a focus on. So yeah, time. I always look at it, time. We know the attention spans vary. There's some good research coming out on that, and they're conflicting is the problem. So I have done a number of articles for Quality Matters on this topic. In fact, I had one come out yesterday about captioning. If you're relying on live captions, for an example, from YouTube, that's not good enough. You need to go in there and fix it. I even provide some pointers on resources on where to go to fix it, but also it talks about how all your students are using captions, not just your deaf and hard of hearing, and why they're using captions. All right, and I see, can I share thoughts about which formats are discussing a most potential for reinventing? Yeah, I have not had a chance to read Rege's article yet today from Inside Higher Ed. I saw the headline. I'm like, oh, that looks like a lot of fun. People in general like to think that we don't want to break things. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And what I like to tell people, this pandemic broke everything. So it's okay to go fix everything. And I think something we forgot about was the video classrooms. I really think that we forgot how important video conferencing could be for some of our students. Some of our students are highly self-regulated, and asynchronous on learning is perfect for them. A lot of our students are not as self-regulated. They need to have that regulation of synchronous time with a faculty member. And that's why I'm reframing the conversation. And so in my mind, that's the reinvent application revision question of let's rethink this into two models of let's ask the synchronous versus asynchronous question first and not later. Because when we ask about technology first, classroom first, I think by doing this way, we can now serve other students who are place bound and want to participate. So that's one of the things to know. And also, as Patricia pointed out, there's actually research supporting your statement about letting the students know the length of time ahead of time because they can plan accordingly. And that does help encourage engagement. So yeah, I think if we think about synchronous versus asynchronous, this live online model, it's not ideal for a lot of things, but you know what? We've got students who are loving it. We are probably reaching some students who we may have lost. And now that we've done that, they have anxiety issues. They're afraid of the classroom. Now they can do this. If we can do this more, I think this is a good question to ask. So it's a really fun time to be here. And Karen, I know we're right up against time here in the next few moments. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's anything else that needs to come up.
I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, but I did want to thank you very much on behalf of Maryland Online. This has been fabulous and very enlightening.
Well, thank you very much. And if you have any more questions, my contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to me. This is a challenging time, but it's also an interesting time because I think it's giving us a chance to rethink things. I think live video has a place in our education. My beginning in distance learning began with the satellite-based television programs. I'm not saying we go back to that, but I think with the technologies we have today, we can get there. We know there's issues with bandwidth to some of our students, even here in Phoenix, in the urban areas. We know that there is still a digital divide that needs to be bridged. So we probably need to, I think the number one thing is how do we diversify to meet more students in more ways? And that's where flipped classrooms, blended classroom, and thinking synchronously versus asynchronously, I think is going to be a great way to help our students.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. It's been a pleasure having you with us today. And hopefully we'll be meeting up with you again in the future. We really appreciate your time. And to everyone else, thank you for participating today on behalf of Maryland Online, and look forward to some of the other webinars that we have coming up this spring. So thank you all, and be safe and have a great day.
Yes, thank you, everyone.